Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored. In this episode of What Is On My Wrist, we're talking about a Rolex Explorer I, reference 14270. It's from 1991. Really interesting watch. Love these watches and I'm excited to talk about it in this week's episode. Let's dive into the details, shall we? Let's dive in. This isn't a dive watch, I'm using a dive watch pun because that's what I do. I'm gonna do it. So neo-vintage watches are post-vintage, pre-modern watches. I know that that is a mouthful, but essentially watches that are kind of in like that 1980, I guess you could say like 84 into like the late 1990s into the early thousands. It's not a ceramic watch, but it's not, a matte dial. Typically these watches possess sapphire crystals. They kind of fall within that specific range where they still leverage tritium, but they're kind of in a transitional period. They're not modern watches, but they're not really true vintage watches either. They're kind of neo-vintage. I think it's what is next to be considered a vintage watch. This reference is a perfect example of that, where you have one foot in the vintage world, leveraging vintage and more traditional elements of Rolex watchmaking, while you still have more of a contemporary and kind of modern design element and also some technical features that make the watch a little bit more modern in terms of its design and functionality. So this is a watch that kind of falls into that category, and we're getting a lot of inquiry on watches like this because I think that they're still accessible from a price point, but they still have some of those vintage or kind of more classic elements to them that make them collectible and desirable. So let's dive into the details and I'll kind of talk about the history of the 14270, why I like it, and why this watch is also moving up the chain in terms of popularity and desirability amongst the collector market. So the Rolex Explorer I, reference 14270, was introduced in 1989. Basically, the 14270 was the successor to the 1016, and the 1016 was in production for 27 years. So there are a lot of different variants and a lot of different, 1016s, so to speak, in terms of that being a range of Explorer I. The 1016 remained largely unchanged throughout its 27 years of production. We saw minor tweaks and things like that, dials and hands and things like that, movements and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, it was, kind of the same watch for a really long time from a functional perspective. It wasn't until the introduction of the 14270 that we saw major technical upgrades to the Explorer I, movement, bracelet, crystal, things like that, and we can kind of dive into it. The 14270, however, was, again, very massive in terms of a technical upgrade. 14270 received a more modern sapphire crystal, a faster beating Rolex caliber 1570 movement, and then the caliber 3000 movement. So technically, Rolex was leveraging better cost-graded movements for the reference. So, minor enhancements to the bracelet, but this is also kind of a bit of a carryover from the later 1016s. Oyster bracelet, non-flip lock clasp, hollow end links, non-solid. We see solid end links at the later end of, the run. Additionally, the earlier examples have lug holes, whereas the later production 14270s possessed a solid end link and a no holes style oyster case. The other thing that is the biggest difference too is the watch received a glossy dial that possessed white gold hands and white gold surrounds. Rolex was kind of shifting away from that matte dial, vintage dial, into a more contemporary or modern style dial, which can be found even in today's Explorer I's or today's modern ceramic era Rolex watches. So again, glossy dial, luminous filled gold markers. What's interesting is the early examples of these watches did leverage tritium, so we kind of have that carryover, right? Tritium had been in existence since the 60s, and then ultimately Rolex introduced Luminova and then Super Luminova. So there's kind of that transitional element to this watch where it still leverages tritium luminous material, but yet glossy, dial with white gold surrounds and luminous filled markers, as opposed to everything being printed on the dial like a 1016. I really like Explorers. It's the watch that kind of bridges the gap between a dress watch and a sport watch, right? You have a Mercedes hour hand, you have a luminous filled, sweep seconds hand, and kind of this sword hand, 369 dial. You have that kind of traditional triangle, marker at the 12 o'clock position, but it's also in a 36 millimeter oyster case with an oyster bracelet. So it's a watch that kind of blends well between being something that you could wear with a suit and or a tuxedo, and or something that you could actually adventure with, right? You could hop in the water with this watch. It's very legible. There's no date complication. So it's a tool watch, but it's a tool watch that blends between a dress watch and something that is ultimately kind of ruggedized, like maybe a sub, but it's kind of its own thing. I like these a lot because this era of watch too provides a watch that you can get into. The price point isn't too astronomical yet. You can get a really nice example like this one for, six, maybe even sub 6,000, 5,500 to 6,000, I think would be a kind of a good budgetary price point for a 14270, especially ones that possess a tritium dial and drilled lugs. But I think what's interesting is you can get into an Explorer One, kind of check all of those boxes and really wear the watch because of the durability elements that Rolex implemented into this watch without really breaking the bank. If you want a 1016, that's going to be a $12,000 to $13,000 investment minimum for a nice matte dial 1016. And also it's a watch that, not saying that you couldn't really live with it and wear it, but this watch has a sapphire crystal, has a higher water resistance, has higher beats per movement in the movement that they're leveraging. Parts are easier to find for these types of things, solid, bracelet. So it's a little bit of a nice kind of blend between something that is traditional vintage, but also something that you can just really wear and kind of get into. And the price point isn't really that unapproachable yet. I think there's also a lot of guys that are looking for birth year watches. I kind of have mixed feelings about people just buying birth year watches. I think you should buy a watch that you like and not just a watch because it's from the year that you were born. Not talking smack on that, but I'm just saying some people get caught up in that. But I think these are birth year watches for a lot of guys, especially guys that were born in the later part of the 80s and into the 1990s. So I think it's a good entry to vintage Rolex and into Rolex without really having to stretch to get something that is true vintage while still having something that is cool and functional. So I really like these guys a lot. I would say in the past year or two, 14270s, especially good tritium 14270s, are not easy to find. They're not hard to find, but people are definitely buying these watches and they're holding on to these watches. So I wouldn't say that they're far and few between, but they're, not insanely easy to find, and finding a good one can obviously be challenging. This specific example is really, really nice. Not a lot of stretch in the bracelet. There's a little bit of stretch there, but the bracelet is in really, really good condition. The case back sticker is actually still on this watch, which is kind of cool. The dial's free from any kind of degradation or chipping or lume loss. And it's kind of got a creamy patina to it. It's not really that stark white. And I think that's also why guys are going after tritium-based watches, because tritium will take on a nice warm patina, whereas Super Luminova remains just stark, kind of bleached white. So this has kind of a creamy patina to it. It's got a vibe, but also, again, sapphire crystal, condition's really nice. You could, this could be your one and only watch. So really, really awesome watch. So in any case, I'll provide a link in the description below so that you can check out the 14270 references. But at one time, especially in Japan, this watch was like the hottest watch because an actor actually wore the watch who was kind of on a show like Saved by the Bell. So there was a lot of guys wanting to kind of emulate that style. And so oddly enough, you find a lot of these 14270s in Japan. And not as many of them, remain here in the US, but they're kind of coming around. So in any case, I'll provide a link in the description below. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe as always. And be sure to check us out on Instagram for the latest updates from Craft and Tailored. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I will see you in the next one.